of years we have seen some various different tools and policy or directions being indicated by the various governments in regards to organic waste management, an indication of trying to remove that from the refuse stream and trying to divert that for other uses. Whilst there was some indication around this in terms of targets and timeframes and what that meant for council services, that's not been mandated as yet. So I think that's just something for us to keep in mind as we work through this. Obviously that direction has been set, and I think there's reasonable agreement across parties in terms of better use and management of waste, but no direct outcomes in terms of having to do anything at this point in time. Chris, over to you.
Can I just confirm that that's coming through loud enough? Cool. Okay, so there's, we've done some very similar studies for a number of other local authorities around New Zealand. We've also got exposure to what's happening in Australia. So it's easy for us to talk generically, but obviously critical is for us to think about how some of that broader knowledge might apply within the Southland region. So I guess what we're alluding to in this slide is some of the specific issues that we've identified as we've been looking at your situation. So you can read for yourself, but there's obviously relatively small scale here, and that has some implications, particularly from a processing perspective. You've got climate that is different to other parts of the country to varying degrees, and that has some implications in terms of temperatures, but also in terms of an excess of moisture at times, and at other times maybe even a deficit. You've got a mixture of urban and rural, and often different solutions apply in different areas, so we've certainly considered that a lot, although you will have noted in the modelling that we've taken things at a regional level as a way of actually enabling us to compare different options. So there's certainly some optimisation opportunities there. Associated with that urban-rural split is similar logistics challenges. You've got some pretty long distances. One of the interesting things to think about from an organic materials management perspective is, unlike things like glass or plastics or metals, you have the ability to use those organic materials locally potentially. So that may or may not get you out of jail in terms of some of those distance or logistics challenges, depending on the solutions that you choose to apply. The other thing that we discovered as we scratched the surface in Southland is that you've got a pretty interested range of people within the private sector, both within kind of what you would consider the waste sector, so the waste collectors and associated organisations, but also more broadly. So I certainly wasn't aware before we started this project that you've got TNZ sitting just outside Invercargill who are supplying the lower half of the South Island with compost product into places like hardware stores and so on. So you've actually got some pretty significant things happening already in terms of managing organic materials. Organic materials that as managers or governors of your local authority waste system, you actually don't see at the moment. They simply stay in the private sector right through to sales to the community. Sophie's already talked about the policy uncertainty. There's an indication of a mandate, but certainly nothing appearing, and it seems reasonably unlikely that any mandate will occur anytime soon. There's some things to think about in terms of procurement and lead time if you want to start to move towards some sort of organic materials management process, both in terms of collections if you go down that track and in terms of processing. And that plays into a pretty extended timeline from deciding to do something and actually having action happening on the ground. And we're talking several years, quite likely. There's interaction between what you do in organic materials and some of the other services that you currently provide to your residents and communities. And one of the things that we actually haven't modelled, but is certainly something that you should bring into the mix if you do decide to proceed with an organic materials recovery, is what you're doing in the refuse space. Because what we're trying to do with an organic materials collection is take stuff out of your rubbish bin and put it somewhere else. So that opens the question of, can we do something? Therefore, can we do something different with the rubbish bins? And we've seen that play out in different parts of New Zealand and Australia as well. So I can certainly talk to some examples of the implications of that and how that's been managed. And what we've seen done, again, around New Zealand and in other parts of the world is trialling different solutions as well. And if you are looking to move forward in this space, actually considering doing some trials for what might work, particularly in some of your smaller communities, outside of kind of the normal or the typical collection services, some trial work's probably a good idea.
I'm wondering if we want to pause there, if there's any questions or any comments or anything that anyone wants to pick up on.
Look, I've read your report, and I'm just wondering why the AB Lime are putting in a 1 megawatt power station. Why was that not included?
It's context in terms of what they're doing on their site. So actually, when we came down to spend some time talking to a range of stakeholders, we had a good conversation with AB Lime and a discussion around this particular issue. And the reality of a organic materials collection service targeting household waste is that while that will have some impact, it's not unlikely to materially impact on the viability or the desirability of AB Lime making the investments that they are making. So it's not a non-issue, but it's not going to change the viability of what they're doing.
But here we are looking at perhaps having a green bin that's collected along with our yellow and red, and taking it off somewhere. And I see Green Island was even mentioned. That's a bit scary. Yet you've got the ability with the 1 megawatt generator that powers 600 homes. So and it's only 20 odd mile away. Why? I'm just wondering, green waste then would become actually a valuable fuel. I've just come back from a month in the States. I've been down South Tennessee, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. All their landfills have massive power stations attached to them. That's all they do. There is only one bin collected, and they pick it up and they send it out there, and they produce a massive amount of power. Why is that being discounted as a very practical way of dealing with green waste? It seems to be, we don't seem to be going down that path. We seem to be doing everything else except that.
Yeah, I think it's probably important to note that we're not seeing it as an either-or. So I think regardless of the decisions that you might make in terms of organic materials collection, the opportunity will remain to collect and utilise the landfill gas at the AB Lime facility. And absolutely that should occur, and we're seeing that play out across New Zealand in terms of landfill facilities where there are organic materials collections, and Christchurch is a good example of that, where they're generating power at Cape Valley. They've also got a food and garden organics collection across the Canterbury, that part of Canterbury. So I don't think it's if we put organic waste in place, then it precludes that. I guess the second point is that if we're looking to maximise the benefit from the materials that we have available to us, so if we look at green waste, then you're correct. One option is to put that into landfill, allow that to degrade anaerobically, capture the gas and generate power or heat, and AB Lime are doing a fantastic job of that. Another option, complementary option most likely, is to actually segregate that material, generate compost or a similar product, and derive some value from that in terms of soil benefits, in terms of some nutrient benefits and so on as well. So while there's the ability to capture gas, it's not necessarily the most value that we can get from that material.
Okay, right. My last question is, there's no mention of the emission factors mentioned around collection. So if we're picking up a third bin, okay, that means an extra trip of a truck, and we're looking at not everyone is going to be putting out a green bin.
Yep.
And this is going to come to our council, because if it's a compulsory rateable thing, then
Yep.
you're going to get some very angry people, because I compost at home.
Yeah, sure.
There'll be no green waste going out. So what you're basically doing is it's becoming a bit of a dictatorship, that you're telling people, you will have a green bin, you will put out green waste, and people go, no, I'm doing my own composting. So where is that emission, those figures of that collection service?
Jump into that. So we,
and I mean, it needs to be there.
Oh, totally, yeah, and we have done some.
But I'm not seeing it.
Okay, so we have done some work in that space.
Do you want me to do it on then?
Do we jump forward? So we have actually looked at that, and I think one of the things that's worth noting is that even with a landfill gas and utilisation system like we've got at AB Lime, there will be fugitive emissions, and so there are emissions factors for that, for the fugitive emissions from landfill. So if we can,
they're collecting 99.95. That's pretty high.
So there's some factors around what is remaining, and so if we compare that with a diversion of materials to composting, for example, then there is a net emissions benefit from doing so. The transport emissions do occur, you're absolutely right, in terms of driving your diesel trucks around and picking materials up, but that's relatively immaterial versus the savings that you're actually achieving by diverting that material. In terms of the providing a service to everyone, I think it's an important consideration for you as a waste advisory group to decide on whether that's the right way to go forward. One of the things that we have looked at is the idea of a smaller bin that means that it's largely targeting a small amount of green waste and organic and food waste, rather than trying to replace home composting or those who might actually be paying for a garden waste collection. I think there's several thousand who are doing so here in Invercargill, for example.
Christine, I think you had a question, and just bearing in mind the purpose of the presentation and our questions at this stage should be just in terms of what's in the report. The next item we'll actually get to discuss in a little more detail some of the issues underlying it.
Okay. I just wonder, you talked about it's not, the current government hasn't made a decision or moved the legislation along, and you talked about a long lead-in time. So if that does come before 2027, that's likely to extend out the timeline for implementation as well, do you think?
That would seem like a reasonable approach.
Yeah. And have you got any idea why in the rural areas for towns over 1,000 people, do you know where the 1,000 comes from? Is there evidence to say this works for?
No, I don't think it's necessarily based on service provision in terms of any sort of scientific detail. I think it's just to be able to put a line around what is reasonable. In saying that, it is a guide. If councils want to provide a collection service to those communities, then there's nothing stopping them from doing that. I think it was just about recognising that there are some differences between urban and rural environments and how particularly organic waste is produced, managed within those spaces. So it kind of allows or enables an ability to do something a little bit different, should you want to.
Yes, I suspect the cost would focus the attitudes quite quickly. Yeah.
Can I get you to have a microphone that's a bit closer, and so can you speak up a bit when you're talking, please?
Oh, yeah, okay. Should we carry on?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So in terms of how other councils are currently collecting their organic material, no, we don't want to move.
It's not working.
Am I pointing it?
Here
There we go.
Yeah.
No, too far. There we go. So I suppose we just wanted to highlight, there isn't necessarily one way of doing this. There are a few different ways that this can be done. So in terms of if a council is collecting only food organics, it tends to be in those smaller 23-litre bins, noting that this is a manual collection from the curbside, so it's not so automated, whereas if it is a mix of food and garden, or even garden on their own, it tends to be in those larger bins, easier to sort of pick up by the truck. So this obviously has collection implications, contract implications. Generally, where there's food involved, it is a weekly collection, whereas if it is only garden or green waste, it tends to be that can sit there for a bit longer, so you are looking at a longer sort of frequency between collections. In terms of application, where it is food as well, generally we are finding that councils, it is that standard sort of everyone gets a bin, everyone gets that service to use, whereas if it is green, it tends to be something that people can opt into or decide if that's something that suits them and their household. There's some indicative costs up there in terms of the different services. Obviously that has implications around frequency and the bin size, and some examples. So, the point of this, I guess, is to show that there are various ways that various councils are doing this currently. Some of them are doing a mix. So up there on the screen you can see that Tauranga City Council, as an example, are doing their food organics only collection, but also have an opt-in organics green waste only collection. So there is no one way to do this. And I suppose that comes back to the point that Chris was making at the beginning around what is it that best suits this region. And in terms of processing, the same thing. So depending on what you are collecting has an implication on what kind of process you might want to look at. And obviously that processing approach can have an impact on the quality and type of product that you are producing, and then the markets that you might have access to. So it is something that kind of, there's implications from whichever way you go, and there's knock-on effects from those various aspects. One of the things that we don't have on there at the moment is obviously emerging technologies. So we are seeing some new technologies come in, such as soldier fly. I think that's got that right. So whilst these are the standards that are currently used across New Zealand, there are things that are we're seeing new and are being tested across the islands. Keep going. So in terms of having looked at the data and then the information that we have seen through the available data, obviously there is quite a network of green waste drop-off facilities across the region. They're reasonably well used. There are some varying prices in terms of people dropping that off at the gate. I guess just for context, a carload is around 50 to 150 kgs. And we saw a bit of a spike in 23-24 in terms of the amount of material that is coming through. I think also to note within that bar graph, there is a bit of a difference between how these services are used between rural and urban areas. So I think that's also an indication or something to keep in mind when looking at how these services are used, and therefore where there might be a need for a future service. And I guess of note, on average, 30% of the waste that's being deposited at each of the transfer stations is classified as organic waste. So there's a fair bit of material that's sort of coming in here. And also then, in terms of how that's captured at landfill, there's mostly what we are seeing diverted is that green waste, that sort of green material at those drop-offs. Everything else, in terms of organic material, is going to landfill. So something to keep in mind. And obviously, this is information that's based on 2018 data, so it's something that I think needs some context. There is a swap, a sort of data analysis that is currently underway or has completed, so there should be some updated figures for this soon. But for now, this is the data that we're working on, and it gives us a good indication of kind of what's happening within that system. Chris, over to you.
So,
sorry. Yeah.
See if I can make it work. I just wanted to make sure that people could interpret that diagram on the right-hand side, whether that makes sense, because we use these quite a bit. But there's actually some good news in there in terms of the sort of diversion of green waste in particular that's occurring. You're getting up sort of 40% by the looks across the three councils. So there's some really good stuff happening already at transfer station. We certainly don't want to break that. It's really around how do we deal with the remainder, because that is driving volume of material to landfill, and it is driving management costs at landfill as well. So there's certainly some benefits in potentially reducing those quantities. What we're not showing on there is some of the primary sector material streams that are going into AB Lime landfill, which are also significant drivers of the gas volume that they're generating. So I think I said earlier on that even with a organic materials collection from household, we're not necessarily going to have a massive impact on the quantity of gas that's been generated at AB Lime at the moment, so it's not necessarily going to have a huge impact on their ability to capture and flare and generate power. That's partly because of that primary sector material, but it's also partly because when material goes into landfill, there's quite a long timeline where that material breaks down and generates gas. So it's important to capture the material, but it may not necessarily be black and white around whether that has the impact on the viability of what they're doing at the moment. And we've had quite a detailed conversation with them about that.
Yeah, Keith, I'd just like to challenge that, because the end game that I'm seeing down one path is completely diverting green waste, anything green, out of what goes to AB Lime from the public. That's what I'm looking at. That is one possibility. And to say that that would not have an impact on them, I think is a bit, I actually believe it would, because we put all our green waste in the red bin, food waste, because I know where it's going.
Yeah.
And I do that on purpose. I put my lawn clippings in our own composting. So, I'm making a choice, an educated choice on what I'm doing with, because I would sooner have power generated, which I think is, rather than have horrible windmills plastered everywhere, I'd sooner do it from a landfill. So I think there definitely is repercussions if one of the solutions is complete diversion of consumer green waste.
Yeah, you're correct, but I think there's, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on, but when you're establishing a collection system, one of the things you need to be really careful to recognise is that not everybody will participate in that collection system. And the people that do participate in that collection system won't necessarily put all of the materials they could put into the organic bin. So when you actually run out your modelling of that, while we might target the green waste, where our working assumption is that you might get 50% of the materials available from households. So I think there will be a reduction, but our evaluation of the overall data set is that the total organic loads into the landfill won't necessarily impact on the viability of the gas generation. So it's not quite you can have your cake and eat it too, but I think it's also not a catastrophic impact on the landfill gas collection.
Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, and I think part of it too is just looking at that $60 a tonne levy that we're paying. So if it is going through the landfill on your grass clippings and everything, we're paying for it, and then it's getting used to generate power. So it's how to separate that out. So if there's a benefit coming from it, and that levy is to stop waste going to landfill, and that kind of stuff might not be need to be classified as waste. So yeah, I think there is another angle to look at it in terms of how it's separated out, but yeah, potentially not in separate bins.
I guess from the Wellington perspective, it does not matter what sort of waste it is going to the landfill, the levy applies, and fees.
But if it's getting turned into compost or getting turned into power, separated out from the bins, then we won't be paying that levy in theory.
Right. That's correct. And also emissions trading scheme charges you're attracting at landfill as well. So there are some benefits in that regard as well. Yeah. So there's a few different threads in there around what the right solution might be. And what you may have noticed is that of all of the options that we evaluated, the traffic light sort of tables, there simply isn't something that ticks every box. This isn't an absolute no-brainer solution. There's some that look on balance like they might be worth pursuing, but there's certainly positives and negatives with every possibility on the table. Let's see if I can get this to work for me. Do I have to put my hand up in the air? Look at that. So infrastructure-wise, you'll probably know this far more intimately than me. We've got a range of transfer station, recycling centres, etc. across the facility, a couple of green waste only sites, so pretty well serviced across the region. So I think that in terms of actually capturing material from a green waste perspective, as Soph said, you're doing pretty well at the moment. Most of that material is largely stockpiled and kind of used locally for various purposes. So I guess one of the things that I often bring to this type of exercise is understanding not only what might the least cost option be, but how might we actually maximise the benefit of that material or the value of that material. So there's certainly potential to do some additional processing with that material and produce a higher value product for your communities or even as a revenue stream. And TNZ are a good example of that in Southland. So there's actually a range of things going on at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware. So there is food rescue occurring, a lot of stockpiling and shredding going right across that transfer station network. There is some community composting occurring. We've got people like TNZ who are doing windrow composting, and a number of the bigger farms where they've got winter grazing, wintering barns are actually composting their material and reusing on their properties. And then obviously there's material going to landfill. So all of those are valid solutions, and as has been highlighted already, your landfilling in the Southland region is actually of very high standard. So that's not an inherently bad thing in its own right. It's really around, are we getting the most value from those materials that we possibly could for our community? We've probably talked about this, and again, I suspect you know a lot more of the intimate detail than I do. This is a Class 1 landfill. It's got landfill gas recovery. You're reusing gas both for heat and looking to move into power generation as well. It's got a very low unique emissions factor, which recognises that there are still some fugitive emissions, but there's a lot of beneficial or a lot of benefit derived from capture and use of that gas. So you're basically in the best situation you could be from a landfilling perspective would be my thought. And you guys were leaders in this space some time ago. I think this is still mine, isn't it? So I had the pleasure of spending a couple of days down here connecting with a few key stakeholders. We've probably talked about this a little bit already. Probably the big discovery for me was the TNZ activity, who are dealing with a whole range of organic materials without actually touching the waste management system. They currently use sawdust and compost things like paunch and so on out of some of the meat processing sites. One of the challenges they articulated to us was that there's a bit of competition going on for sawdust with wintering barns, so they're actually a little bit nervous about that. They've taken a look at green waste from transfer stations, but found that that's too contaminated, both with things like rocks and so on, but also things like plastic. So they simply cannot use that in their product because they don't want to send product into the bags to Mitre 10 or Bunnings or wherever it might be. So that's a pity, but it does highlight potentially an opportunity to actually improve the value of that green waste from its current use, where it's shredded and stockpiled or used for landfill capping, that type of thing, to actually something that's going back into the economy as a valuable product, potentially across the lower part of the South Island. The other thing that they flagged is grass clippings. For people who use a pesticide called clopyralid, it's fantastic, but it doesn't break down in composting. So that's fine if you're going to use your compost on lawns, but it's not a great thing if you use it for growing something like tomatoes because it kills them. So they're obviously nervous about that. They don't really want their compost to kill plants. So that's the other thing that they are worried about alongside those physical contaminants. So from a rural perspective, as I'm sure you're aware, food waste tends to be much less of an issue in terms of feeding to animals or into composting on site, and green waste is often burnt as well. And there's bulk liquids from both primary processing and other activities being spread onto land. So there's a range of things that are going on at the moment. Obviously, if we are looking at processing, tapping into things like the primary sector, then we've got some seasonality considerations, whether that's things like meat processing, dairy, but also fisheries waste, fish processing. The good demand for food rescue, and there's actually, interestingly, quite a high demand for wood waste type products for biomass fuel as well. So what that means is there's some, for woody waste in particular, there's a number of different outlets for that material that are quite active within the region. So that's kind of interesting if we're starting to think about composting, and it makes green waste potentially, if not valuable, certainly a very usable resource as a source of woody material for bulking other materials for composting. Cool, yeah, I was going to say, questions?
No, just regarding if council had a green bin collection, but if people put grass clippings in it and it was solely intended for food waste, then that would contaminate it and then it would be useless. So how do you, I mean, we get that at the moment with our recycling bins. You know, we all know it should be nice, clean, but it's not.
Yep.
So how does that work? Who takes the risk of putting contaminated materials, you know, into a commercial composting situation? How do you work that out?
Yeah, there's a lot of devil in that detail. I think if council's providing a service, then there would be an element of education, communication and enforcement.
It doesn't work.
I think that sits alongside other activities, and then it becomes effectively a judgment call around whether you want to treat that as, for example, clopyralid containing materials, in which case you're limited in your markets, or you invest a whole lot of effort in managing that.
So say we decide that. Say we can't guarantee the quality of what our green waste is in our green bin, then that surely must factor into is it the right use?
Yep.
Is it the right use? Because obviously if everyone did it exactly right, and we know it doesn't, we absolutely know it doesn't. People have a green bin, and if they're being rated, I'll have to ask Erin on this, if it came in, would it be a rateable service for everyone? You couldn't do it. I've never seen an opt-in, opt-out green bin done in any council.
I think you definitely have options to do opt-in or opt-out. I think the key piece you need to look at, though, is whether or not it's viable on the basis of an opt-in, opt-out. Yep. And therefore, if you have the ability to put it in your red bin, does that impact what you're doing with your red bin collection, etc. So agree that's something that you'd need to work through as to whether or not an opt-in, opt-out would work.
And when you look at what's coming up, that's I think what you flagged is a valid point.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the opt-in, opt-out is an interesting conversation. There's certainly a number of optional green waste only collections around the country, and offshore as well. Food and garden or a food only collections normally something that's provided to the full community. Yeah, so certainly something that's worth considering in more detail. But we might move on to the option evaluation piece.
So in terms of the evaluation, just quickly cover the multi-criteria analysis that we developed alongside excuse me, the councils and the various things that we looked at. So from affordability in markets, greenhouse gas emissions, circular economy, flexibility and integration. So in terms of, I guess, that more operational aspect, ease of use, playing into that, people actually using the service, and then policy compatibility. So whilst there is obviously no direct mandate, we did look at this in terms of if that was to come in, what impact would it have, or the ability to respond to that quickly. All of these are weighted the same in the process that we undertook, but I guess, if there was a discussion around greenhouse gas being more important or even affordability, then there is ability, I guess, to go back in more detail and have a look at that. And in terms of our approach, we started with collections, so having a look at what those different collection options might be. And when I say collections, we also looked at drop-off as a version of a collection as well. And then from there moved into processing, and also then considered that sort of more remote communities or rural sort of approach. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the detail here because I think it's probably more important to jump to the trade-offs. But essentially, there were 8 different options that we looked at in terms of collection services. So from no service, so essentially that waste continues to go to landfill, continue to have that landfill service, but also have that drop-off of green waste at the various transfer stations. So this is essentially the status quo, through to then some different options around what kind of collection might you be collecting, what kind of material might you be collecting, from food only to green only to a mix of both, and then also a consideration of whether or not that should include some commercial food organics, just to sort of, I guess, test that also. And as Chris pointed out before, and as you can see from the colour coding, there is no one option that sticks out. They're all there's pros and cons from each of them or from most of them. And on balance, I guess our approach has been to work out what do those pros and cons look like from each of those options. And looking at those trade-offs, I guess the main trade-offs come down to, that affordability and greenhouse gas aspect, through to ability to kind of meet that policy compatibility, and also flexibility and the likelihood of take-up. Does anyone have any questions on this slide? I guess that's quite a lot of information that we've just run through, but I'm keen to just, any thoughts or questions on any of those options?
Just on the weighting that you use, like affordability on the one that you've ranked as number 1 is poor, but like that actually, in terms of us actually making a decision, probably ranks quite high in terms of everything else as well. So yeah, just a question around, I guess, that ranking and how the weighting's related to it.
Yeah. So I guess each of those different criteria are balanced the same in terms of this. So we haven't necessarily weighted anything more or less. I'm actually going to jump to the next slide. But we recognise that obviously that cost and affordability is a really important aspect. So in terms of those recommended options, we do have that alternative. If this is cost driven, then actually option 1 and 2 are probably the ones that come out on top. So trying to, I guess, demonstrate that depending on where council or the councils feel their priority is within those different criteria, you are going to get a slightly different option come out. And I think that is really important to actually delve into and ask some questions on.
One of the reasons that we tend towards a traffic light type presentation rather than numbers and weighting is that if you see a calculation in a number, then you tend to think that's the answer. And I think the real value of this type of multi-criteria analysis is that it forces us to balance a range of potentially competing factors. So, and ultimately we've gone through that exercise with the council teams and tried to arrive at a balance on that, but it's very much for you to test in consideration of your community's needs and wants.
Ian?
I guess my main concern is legislative, and we're still going through it, but we've just seen what danger there was with Three Waters and the pathway that was going, and there was no logic in that whatsoever. And I'm seeing the same coming out of a central government where there is no logic in dealing with green waste. It's all theoretical, it's all feel good, and they're very ignorant of what is actually being done elsewhere around the world. So that's what scares me.
And that's really a central point to what we need to talk about as part of the next item.
Yeah, but...
Just keep it to the questions at this stage.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think what we can be confident of from a government perspective is that the levy and the emissions trading scheme costs that you are exposed to from a landfill disposal perspective will at best stay static, are far more likely to continue to rise to varying degrees. I think that's important to consider. Yeah.
No further questions? So we'll jump into, I know we've kind of worked through that really quickly, but I think it's actually that discussion piece that's probably of more value here. You know, like we've said, all of those options, there's pros and cons from each. So we'll move on quickly, but if we do want to go back and have a discussion on any of those at the end, we're happy to do that. And Chris, I'll pass to you.
Sure. So, as So said, we've kind of looked at collection options and then looked at processing options and looked at how they work together. Depending on what you collect, that has some impact on what the viable options are for processing. So if you're collecting food only, then you could take that into a wet anaerobic digestion type of process, or you could combine it with some sort of bulking agent for composting. If you're collecting a garden waste stream, it's not really suitable for anaerobic digestion in a conventional sense. So there's a couple of limitations there. And so I guess what you're looking at here, again, we won't sweat the detail because you've got the detail sitting within the report, but a number of different processing options. We have pulled in Green Island there as a facility that is being established at the moment in Dunedin that conceivably you could have access to if you were happy to transport materials up there. So that was kind of what if we didn't actually develop capacity here but we chose to transport, what would that look like?
Sorry, can I ask how much is it costing Dunedin City Council to build that facility?
I don't think we have that number at our fingertips. We may be able to find published
So
information.
around 40 million, 42 million?
That doesn't seem like an unreasonable number to me, yeah. So it's not a cheap facility. And there are, and I guess one of the reasons you may choose to go with accessing that facility if you were going down this track is there are economies of scale. So if you were to halve the size of the facility, you wouldn't necessarily halve your capital investment because there's components that are relatively fixed almost regardless of scale. So that is a challenge for Southland in terms of the quantity of material that you're developing. So that, I guess the reason for bringing that is that potentially gives you the opportunity to access some of those economies of scale and also avoid the need to find the upfront capital costs, which wouldn't be an unwelcome opportunity if you're going down this track. So yeah, great question, thank you. Probably a bit of a similar picture here in terms of that multi-criteria assessment framework. There's no absolutely perfect scenario. Probably the one that pops out the most promising for us is an in-vessel composting scenario. So basically this is about composting process but containing it in a way that means that you can manage issues particularly around odour, but you can also manage aeration and things like that. So when you're starting to deal with stuff like food waste, you're very likely to get anaerobic conditions within your composting process, which generates unpleasant odours. As soon as you turn that material, you release those odours. If you're in an enclosed environment, you can actually manage those odours. The way they manage that up at TNZ, where they are, I'm guessing, creating some pretty interesting odours at certain points in time, as they're very careful around when they choose to turn their materials. And they're also located in not a bad spot with, shall we say, similar natures of odours in the same area. So similar table, again, this is sitting within the report if you've had a read through it, around advantages and disadvantages. A lot of what we've thought about here are things like access to market, managing some of those downstream impacts. The downside of something like Invercargill is that it's relatively expensive, and that's what you end up having to do to manage some of the other impacts. We've got things like dry digestion, which is a relatively emerging technology, but is certainly a possibility. But all of the other technologies we're noting here are implemented in at least 1 or 2 facilities across New Zealand and plenty across Australasia. Any questions about the processing side of things? No, bamboozled you with too much information. So you may have noticed when we talked about the collections, our suggestion was a FOGO, or Food and Garden Organics collection. Our suggestion would be that you put those food and garden organics into a relatively small container, and this is to avoid what is normally called induced waste. So if I give someone a 240 litre wheelie bin for organic waste, there's a pretty good chance they'll fill it if it's available to them, and you'll be seeing that already with your waste bins. That bin will be filled if the capacity's there. So if someone is composting at home, they might decide that it's actually no longer worth doing that. They'll chuck everything into your new organics bin. So all of a sudden you're dealing with waste that you haven't been dealing with previously. So that's induced waste. That actually increases the total quantity of materials you're managing. So the thinking behind doing a smaller bin, and this is what places like Christchurch do, is that you provide enough capacity to capture materials from people who are generating a little bit of green waste. If they're generating a lot of green waste, they can either choose to purchase their own green waste collection or compost at home, as they may already be doing. So you're providing a service, but you're not actually creating a whole lot of new materials that you need to manage. So what we've got listed on this slide is just the processes that might be suitable for that scenario, for that food and garden organic. So the various composting scenarios at varying scales. Probably the key missing ones there are vermicomposting. So this is worm farming. Doesn't really like a whole lot of particularly woody green waste, and wet digestion, which again isn't suitable for woody green waste. All of the others can certainly manage that stream. So from a processing perspective, again, if you've read through the report, you'll know that we've suggested that if you were to do something within region with food and a garden organic stream, then an in-vessel composting solution is a good option. And there's multiple variations on that theme. And as we've already discussed, if you are going down that track, then you'd be sensible to look at how does that stack up against transporting materials up to Dunedin to take advantage of the investment that's being made up there. And my guess is that the sort of capital costs and operational costs that you might end up spending for a local facility within the region would be of a similar order to what you may end up paying for at a lower processing or gate fee in Dunedin alongside the transport costs up there. But that is something that you will need to test through the market if you want to go down that track. Cool. Any questions or thoughts before we kind of bring ourselves to a bit of a close?
Well, it's cheaper than a museum.
Oh, community composting. That snuck in. So I guess this is one of the things that you need to be careful of when you're looking at introducing a council service, if this is on the table, is that you don't remove activity that's already occurring. And particularly if you look at your smaller communities, almost the last thing you want to do is to slap a big collection service on them when the community's already doing something. So there's kind of a couple of scenarios there. One could be that you just encourage or enable or support the community to do things locally. You could look at doing a localised collection and bringing that to a local community scale composting service, and that would make a lot of sense for smaller communities. Or you may just simply leave those communities alone and let the community get on with it. And all of those are valid solutions. But I guess a key principle for us when we think about these things is avoid replicating or overriding activities that are already occurring. And we had a number of conversations as part of our stakeholder engagement with people who are or are very enthusiastic about implementing these types of schemes across the region. So I think that's got to be a really important part of starting to think about the detail if you decide to go down this track. So a whole lot of benefits, which I'm sure a lot of you would be across. Obviously, just general community engagement, it can tend to be relatively low cost. You need to think a little bit around risks such as odour if you're starting to load up a whole lot of particularly food waste materials. And obviously we see opportunity not only for a lot of your rural communities but also across onto Stewart Island. So I think that's almost has to be any part of a solution if councils decide that they want to move into the space. And even if you decide that you don't want to offer a more broad organic materials collection, there's no reason why this can't continue to be part of the mix across the region. And certainly potential to engage with the ministry should they choose to go down the mandatory route around where this might fit, particularly for your smaller communities, rather than just a cookie cutter organic waste collection for some of your smaller, more remote communities. Any thoughts, comments on that? Nope. Cool. Decision making, I might hand back to you.
So I guess in terms of the work that's been done and the conversations that have been had, there's a fair few key decisions that the councils need to make in terms of going forward from here. Do the councils want to pursue an organic waste management separation and diversion in lieu of clear legislative direction? I think we've touched on that a little bit today already, that unclarity, that uncertainty, and what does that mean for you guys right now and then into the short term? Do the councils want to have a more active role in the delivery of those processing options, or do they just want to enable that private sector to fill this role or even utilise some of those existing facilities that are out there, like the Dunedin example? Do the councils want to have a more active role in the delivery and funding of those community-based solutions? So in terms of that community option that we've just touched on, there's I guess a scale of how much council might want to be involved or not in terms of some of that. And do the councils want to introduce new or additional costs and charges to support those services? So I think these are some really key decisions that need to be made. I guess of note in terms of those decisions is obviously that this data is on most of this data is on that 2018 swap. So it will be interesting to relook at the new information that comes out from this year to just make sure that those trends that we have seen are consistent and that they are still in play. Or if there's anything new that we didn't expect to see from some of that organic material and where it's going and where it's come from. And also in terms of that community and rural sort of option, a need to engage with those communities in terms of that option before kind of looking at what that does or doesn't look like in order that it's something that is sustainable and that can be fulfilled into the future as well. Any questions or conversation?
No. So thank you for that presentation. I think the questions that you've posed there, I'll be in at the meeting how you want to progress it. They are the detail, but when I look at the next report, there's two things that come out. When in terms of timing, do we do things and what do we do? And I'm just wondering whether the better approach is to look at the next report in terms of where the legislative issues sit in particular, and then to double back to these questions and deal with them at that stage if people are comfortable. So the report starts at page 65. That's come from our director, and we can take it, I think, as read unless there's anything in particular you want to stress. I think the overview that we've been given in the presentation gives us a number of the implementation issues, but there's also the overview issues which, in terms of the timing in particular, So, yeah, I'm in your hands in terms of how you want to progress this team, and appreciate some feedback. Rob?
Thanks, Keith. I'll just talk from a sort of a Southland district point of view, and we've got that kind of wider geographical base where a collection for us probably doesn't make too much sense from an affordability point of view. But looking at the key decisions on that slide, I think looking at that more active role in the delivery and funding of community-based solutions is a key. I'm just thinking of 2 communities that I know of that have got community garden kind of facilities where we could actually enable them to do composting, even utilising that $50,000 fund to fund some of those sort of initiatives to do that local stuff, which will actually pull in community ownership of the problem as well. If they can see the fruits of their labour in terms of it coming into fruition in their community, they're less likely to contaminate the stuff that's going through, and I think you get a good outcome from that point of view. And also, if we were to do bulk, like to have to collect it, I'm thinking, and I'll use Lumsden as an example, where we currently have green waste coming into the transfer station. I followed an empty truck and trailer into town today, so you could quite easily bulk store it at those sort of transfer stations, and then when you had empty truck and trailers going in, you could utilise those, because it doesn't have to happen on a certain day, to transfer that into facilities like what you talked about in Invercargill or something there. So having a bit of a more bespoke approach. But I think going down a curbside collection is probably setting ourselves down in a very expensive pathway.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Ian, because certainly one of the takeaways from the presentation is that it's not desirable to duplicate, or I think the words that we used were overriding the existing initiatives. But to me, probably a more important issue is it the view of this group that we should be acting now, or should we be waiting for a firmer direction from government? Christine, Nenia.
I haven't discussed with other councillors.
Can't hear.
Haven't discussed this with other councillors, obviously, so that discussion needs to occur. But I think it would be a very hard sell to our community ratepayers to be saying you might be paying another $200 or $300 for the collection in what would be Winton and Tiana area, when there's no legislative mandate to do that, given the other costs they're faced with double-digit rate rises for several years to come.
Ian?
Yeah.
You look, status quo at the moment, we have the rates at X. What we do in this field is not going to make rates cheaper, full stop. Any of those options will increase rates for Invercargill ratepayers. That's why waiting for legislative direction, it's a bit of a cop-out, and I'd never ever say this, but what I'm hoping for and waiting for this is that actual central government will become more educated on the actual use of this resource. I know that I'm definitely going to see Penny about this, because generating power is a very real thing, and if you can work out some sort of offset with AB Lime where it's a neutral cost to council delivering that, then that's a win. That's an absolute win. So I'm not keen to move forward with anything, and I guess I'm just using the legislative thing as the pause button.
Neville, I'll come then over to Aaron. Any comment from a Gore perspective?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just like to thank the report writers. It's an excellent report. And my last comment, I've got about 3 pages or 4 pages to bring back to council, but I've got my last thing here on number 16 here is decision. Cost to all ratepayers is in the mind of everybody. So do we need to hold this off to legislation? Possibly. Do we need to continue with education? Yes. Do we need to continue to support what's already ongoing? Yes, until it's mandated, I feel. And if we continue with a good educational program and supporting of what's already in process, I think the step will be a lot easier if it is, when it is mandated. That's
Barry?
that's my thought.
Thank you. Barry, were you going to say something?
Yes, it was. My concern would be with their ratepayers as well, putting an extra cost on them. And we have enough trouble with their yellow bins here, with contamination, with people just chucking anything in them. It would worry me with these, if we do mandate another bin, are we going to have to turn around and do bin inspections to make sure it's the right stuff in it? Or that would worry me as well. So I think, personally, I would think we're better to hold off until it is legislated.
Erin, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I'm happy just to probably add something to the broader context of why I've always thought that the work we were doing was valuable, without necessarily thinking that it would lead to a separate curbside collection. I think one of the things is that there are, as we've spoken about, a lot of community groups that are already sort of starting to try to tread a bit of a toe into this space. We see that also in the commercial world in terms of what you can do with your food waste can impact, you know, your hotels and things like that, what they get in terms of their ratings, as well as often schools, etc., are also looking for what they can do to try to divert green waste. And so one of the things that we've had over the recent years is quite often councils being approached around what's council doing in that space, what should people be doing, is there some guidance that's available to various different groups. What I'd say is I think one of the outcomes that I'd like to see of the report is that it gives us the ability to provide the report to these groups and show the research that's been done and potentially provide them some guidance around what pathway to go down. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that the push around trying to get green waste out of landfills, I agree there's places all over the world that are doing different things. There's places that are doing diversion of green waste, there's places that aren't, and I guess that reflects the fact that the different things are done in different places. But I guess where the government, as I understand it's looking to go here, is around the fact that there are quite a few landfills around the country that are struggling for capacity and are struggling with those odour issues associated with landfill gas that don't have well-functioning gas capture systems. And so, you know, in some ways we're being a little bit caught up in that. At the moment, obviously, we've had the change of government and there doesn't seem to be a big likelihood of quick change in this space. There seems to be some other things that are first priority for the government. But also that, you know, to the point, we don't have anything in legislation as yet, and therefore no requirement necessarily to act at this point in time. I think the key thing for me is around what do we do around those community groups who are looking for some guidance, and whether or not there's comfort in providing the report out to them as a bit of a starting point would be my key piece.
I'd be, I guess, to pick up on Neville's point, there is an important education role, or continuing education, and the report that we've got is an extremely valuable resource in helping with that. At some point we need to be talking to our community in terms of the approach, and I'm wondering whether that's a matter that should be considered as part of the waste minimisation plan for next year. So rather than over-consulting, let's use that process to actually inform, get some feedback as well. And while the dollar value is front of mind, there are some valuable initiatives taking place in the community with community-based schemes, and I think WasteNet has a role to assist, ensure that they're able to remain in operation, and I see that as something that is part of our budget for next year we need to be thinking about as well. I've also heard some comments come through in terms, I guess, of are there net gains, or what are the losses in terms of transport of products to different areas, and that opens up a whole other question in terms of what actually is the carbon footprint of our own operations. And in one of the other reports, it's highlighted that that's something we need to be looking at further. So I guess to kind of round off, I think there's a uniform view around the table that at this stage not to proceed with any direct action, but to be mindful of the role from the education point of view, providing information and using the waste minimisation plan and our budgets to look at progressing this further. Is that a fair summary? Ian?
The community communication thing is very important and it's great, but should WasteNet, where does WasteNet's role stop? Because obviously what we're facing in society today is what we eat. We are what we eat. And you look at the obesity, you look at the health that's caused by eating either too much or junk. Now, obviously this is at one end of growing your own food and eating healthy. Now, how far does WasteNet want to be involved in this and actually helping, and seeing it through? Not just saying stopping, but do we want to become more of a partner and really see it through to the end and actually get food on tables and change people's lifestyles? I mean, it's a bit out there, but
our director wants to have a workshop with us, looking at what is our governance role versus the operations role, and I see that as a key component of that in terms of how far do we actually get involved in a number of these issues. It's a valid point, and I guess in the new year, and we'll talk about timing of things later, something to pick up further then.
Cheers.
Any other feedback? So we've kind of, Christine.
Just a comment that I found the report very valuable, and it's not saying we won't do anything with the content of that and the recommendations until the legislation comes in, because I think this is where the discussion is important. Well, the Southern District Council with their community boards, because they can use that information in order to have a discussion with the communities about where can we start now. And also noting that over the next few years there's probably bound to be ongoing technological changes, which you've already summarised here and now, and we'll see those changes and how that might influence our decision making ahead also. And
one of the outputs from the work that's been done in consultation with all of us and with our own councils is the desirability of having reports back to councils coming from our director, and I see the issues that we're dealing with today generates a series of reports that I'd like to see happen in the new year. So it's an opportunity then of putting it out to the wider audience. So we've kind of morphed the two items together. So I think I'd like to go back and get, in terms of item 4, the recommendation was there that we receive the Tonkin and Taylor presentation. If I can have a mover and a seconder for that, please. Christine moving and Barry second. Any further discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. In terms of the recommendations we've then got for item 5, the first is we receive the report on the organics preliminary business case recommendation, and I'll deal with that separately, so if I can have a mover and a seconder for that, please. Mayor Scott moving, second Barry, thank you. So all those in favour, aye. Against, carried. In terms of the further recommendations that we've got there, confirm the next steps to be taken by WasteNet, either progressing a detailed or organics collection and processing business case in advance of the 2027 contract renewal, or incorporating organics collection and processing into the 2027 contract renewal business plan process, or deferring action relating to organics correction and processing business case until government legislation on waste diversion targets and requirements is confirmed.
I would move C.
You'd move the second.
C.
I'm just wondering, that's fine, do we have a seconder to that, Barry? I'm just wondering whether a variation on C might actually be appropriate, and rather than just deferring until government legislation changes, that we actually defer until the waste minimisation plan discussions. Would you be comfortable with that?
Is there a
Let's go
timeline?
and or.
Sorry?
You've got and or there, and or the regional waste management and
Oh,
minimisation.
yes, there is. Yes, is revised. Correct, thank
So
you.
can we leave it sitting like that?
Yes. Yeah, so any further discussion on motion C? Appears to be not. So all those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you for that, and thank you for the presentation that we've had today from Chris and Soph. The amount of work that's gone to it is appreciated. I do have one final question for our Director, in that this has been funded by MFE. So what are our requirements in terms of commitments to MFE, and is any follow-up necessary?
So as WasteNet, we're required to submit a report with various elements, and one of them is to provide feedback on the decision made by the councils around the direction to be taken. So if the decision is to defer, then that's just a matter of feeding that back.
Okay. I think not only the deferral, but the conversation that we've had about education, sharing it, et cetera, there's some messaging in there that is useful to demonstrate that it's not just going to sit on the shelf.
Correct. Yes.
Mayor Scott.
Thank you. If I can just add to that, I wonder if it's worth, if we are feeding back to the government or MFE, that not all landfills are the same as well, and to allow bespoke solutions in the regions as well, in any future decision making.
And I think there's various bullet points in the presentation that we've had today that reinforce that. And I guess not only sending them the report, but there's probably the slide presentation can go back to them as well as some key points of your covering letter.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just provide a comment on the landfill side? I think probably a really good measure of that, and a kind of a sense check on that, is the published or gazetted unique emissions factors across the country, which give you a picture of how well landfill gas is being collected. And as I said, AB Lime's doing a very, very good job. So are a number of other landfills. So I think there's AB Lime is consistent with the well-operated sites. So sites like Cape Valley, Redruth and Timaru, places like Blue Gums and Marlborough. I could list them as I go up the country. So I think absolutely it's a fantastic site, but it's also not an unusual site. So don't lose sight of the fact that you're in the leading pack, not right out the front.
Yeah, and just before you're talking, and I think reinforcing your messaging about communications with the Minister, I think whatever goes back to MFE, it would be good to send a copy direct to the Minister and saying when opportunities arise, we're welcome to discuss matters further with her. And did that pick up on the point you were making here?
I just want to add another thing about AB Lime. It was mentioned how unique it is. One unique thing about it is that if they stopped taking lime out now, creating the hole, there's 100 years there to fill it. Okay. That's if they stop taking lime out, which they're not going to do. And from what I read, the AB Lime model is a leading one. So that we can have that debated at some further time. So no, that was a good discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to item 6, which is at page 187 of the agenda. So we have a report in terms of the strategic plan execution and activity update. Is there anything, Fiona, that you want to stress from the report?
No, we are generally on track to deliver the strategic plan. I've provided a summary table there showing the various items, but overall we are still on track.
Any questions or other feedback from members on that? I see that looking at timing of the waste minimisation plan, consultation deferred until mid-2025 rather than early 2025. And I think this is where the timing of things that we want to get done in the next calendar year is critical. So I think I'd like to see you work backwards so that not only we get the consultation done, but the necessary meetings are held and we firm up our decisions in terms of that document before October next year.
Yes, that's so it is on the last agenda item in terms of the content for the proposed meetings for the 2025 calendar year. I don't know if you want to go through that. It's the very last agenda item.
Yeah.
So
So
we'll leave it till then.
I'll just flag it as we go through. So we have a recommendation that we receive the report. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Mayor Scott. Moving, second Neville. All those, any further discussion? All those in favour, say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Moving on to item 7, page 193. So we have a report in terms of performance indicators update, which I think is just reporting back on trends of late. Is there any questions that arise from that report? Otherwise it can be taken as read. Okay, so if I can have a mover and seconder for the recommendation that we receive the key performance indicators update and note the materials discarded, waste to landfill and diversion data and trends. Can I have a mover, please? Thank you, Neville. Second, Christine. Any further discussion? Appears not. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. Item 8, page 197, Waste Net Education and Communication Activity Update. Again, reporting back as per normal. Any questions arising with regard to that report? Christine?
Probably not a question in relation to the report, but thinking ahead about where our education should be focused, and I've spoken about this before, it might be in addition to it rather than a change, given the rubbish we're seeing on our roadsides and the amount of waste that was picked up by community groups around Dipton, Winton last month. The figures are huge, and it's all going on our roadsides instead of to that daily line where it should be going, and it's about personal responsibility. So while we may be providing great education out to our early childhood centres and to our schools and the main primary schools, I just wonder if we need to be thinking about the secondary schools and where the public are as well. I did ask them to provide with some information about the type of rubbish they're picking up and where they were picking it up from. So I can pass that information on to you to have a wee bit of think about what the other options might be that we have. Thank you.
Ian?
My question is about what feedback have we had from Recycle South about the quality of the product that they're getting in the bins. Are we improving? Are we, or I mean, I see bin inspections are coming into effect first quarter next year, but what is the feedback like about what's happening now?
So we are seeing a very modest improvement in terms of contamination. Last year we were sort of the 18 to 20% contamination. This year has been around 16 to 17, so very modest improvement, but it's been quite stable. So definitely some opportunities for improvement there to drive that number down.
Okay, no, that's good. Thanks, Fiona.
I had a query over the fridge maintenance. And it's under the heading really of residential and community, yet I would have thought that if there were going to be magnets in offices and businesses would be equally effective.
Yes, yeah, we can definitely widen the audience for that.
Right, any other comments? If I can have a mover and a seconder then for the recommendation that we receive the report of the WasteNet Education Communication Activity Update. Ian moved, seconded Christine. Any other discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Now for Chris and Soph, I know it's all riveting stuff that we're talking about here. Feel free to leave at any time that you like. Thank you for your input today.
It's all
Right.
very riveting, mate.
Yeah, we think so. Item 9, WasteNet Community Minimisation Fund recipients on page 201. Do you want to just give a quick highlight here, please?
So we did receive quite a number of applications this year, and I think the pleasing thing was that it was from quite a diverse range of applicants, both in terms of activities but also geography. So we got applications from across Southland, which was, I thought, very pleasing. One of the key things to note that despite those number of applications, we weren't able to allocate the full 50k of funding. So there is a recommendation in the report that we rerun the process early next year to see if we can find some more suitable recipients for that.
Any questions? Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Just in terms of the process for this and how it sort of goes through with the panel, what was the makeup of the panel? Was that, this is probably the governance operational kind of thing for later on, but was that a staff panel? Or?
So we had a member of staff from each of the 3 councils, and we also had the Waste Advisory Group chairman on the panel as well.
Just a thought, just reading this, I wondered whether it'd be worth bringing the applications to this committee prior to them going through. Not sure if that's something that everyone else kind of thinks is valuable or not, but yeah, just in terms of some of the way we do funding around some of our council processes, having the views of the whole table can sometimes add a bit of value to it, although it can also complicate it as well. So
It was an extremely interesting and thorough process where there were 5 criteria, I think, that we used, and the members of the panel needed to spend probably half a day beforehand actually ranking each of the 5 criteria against all of the projects and giving them an overall score. And Fiona ran the process where we actually debated the score that we gave to every item, and we didn't get through it all in one day as a result, because we had some questions that we needed some further information in terms of some of them as well. The bigger the group, the longer it will take. And I just wonder whether there is actually a more streamlined process if members want to have some input. I doubt that you'd want to go through the scoring process that each of the members had, but there may be some merit in identifying what the projects are and giving some feedback, particularly along the lines of, I know these people and you need to be aware of this as from the good, the bad and the ugly side of things, of information that you need to have, be aware of.
Yeah, maybe even just oversight of the applications, even as a step so we can see prior, might be useful.
All right, so we've got two recommendations there. One, that we receive and endorse the report, Waste Community Minimisation Fund recipients, 2024-25, and secondly, endorse the WasteNet Community Waste Minimisation Fund being opened for applications for a second time in the latter part of 24-25. Can I have a mover first and seconder, and then we'll come back and discuss? Sorry, Barry, yes. Moved, seconder? Christine?
I'm happy to move, I just
Yes.
have another question. in
Right,
relation to-
yeah, okay, so I'll throw it open.
Yes, it was just, I wonder if, given we've been through 2 rounds now, or is it 3, that it might be useful just to review the criteria sometime next year in relation to the applications received and looking at the bigger picture too. I mean, noting your comments earlier on about the, in relation to the presentation I just had.
And when you think of some of the other community groups out there, the report highlighted the need, I guess, for staff to be more active in actually promoting this. And I think if that happened by itself would increase the amount of interest. So I actually see as a budget item for the next financial year, maybe we should be looking at actually doing it bigger and better.
Yes.
And in terms of the publicity and that follows with it as well.
And not just the amount of interest, but the type of interest.
Yes, yes, because clearly, one of the ones that came in wasn't appropriate. But it's not for the staff, as when they're talking to these people, to say you don't meet all the criteria. Rather, these are the criteria that will be taken into account. So any further discussion on that? Are members happy for it to go out to another round in terms of how much money is left?
$18,000.
Right. All right, no further discussion. If I can hear, we've had a mover and a seconder. So all those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Which logically moves on to consideration of item 10 at page 206, which is event funding and sponsorship review. Fiona, just a quick overview, please.
Yes, so this was a follow-up paper from the last Waste Advisory Group meeting where it was highlighted that there are a number of events and activities around the region where WasteNet could potentially take a more active role in funding, where they have a waste awareness or a waste minimisation focus. So the paper sort of summarises that there has been a rather ad hoc approach taken to this in comparison to some other council processes around funding those kind of activities, and that there is an opportunity to both provide a more structured approach but also to raise the profile of the potential funding that WasteNet have available.
Any questions that arise from that? So effectively, we've got a recommendation, we'll receive the report and then various options, and it's probably most efficient if I have a mover of one of those 3 options rather than dealing with them all together. Neville.
I'll move.
So
I'll
in
move
terms of
one and two.
A, B or C,
1 and 2, Mr Chairman, right through from A to C.
sorry,
Move 1 and 2, right through from A to C.
right, so you're moving from A to C, and would it be more procedurally correct to pick A, B or C?
C is retain the status quo.
So A talked about increasing funding, B increasing funding and developing and implementing criterion assessment, and C the status
Sorry,
quo.
remove the status quo then, Mr Chairman.
Sorry?
Remove C, Mr Chairman.
Okay. So shall we have some discussion then in terms of A and B as to where it lies, and then we'll get a mover and a seconder. Ian?
Well, I mean, the budget first, obviously, can we afford it? Is it working? I mean, and then the next one is the criteria. Completely different things. So, I don't know. I mean, it seems that everything's working okay. Fiona, what's your thought? Are there other areas we could go to?
So I've put a summary in there of what we've got at the moment. So we've got three main categories. The first is the $50,000 community fund, which we've spoken about in the paper previously. That's a fund that for the last two rounds we haven't been able to distribute fully, so there's that to take into account. In the existing budget there's $5,000 to support community cleanups, and again that isn't something that year on year we allocate fully. And from my understanding that's mostly an awareness or a procedural constraint. I think it's not for lack of want from the community, but just from lack of awareness that the opportunity's there. And the third thing that we've got in the budget is $10,000 to support community events and fairs. So that's whether it's WasteNet going to present at those type of events or to support initiatives such as the Reusable Fashion Awards that encourage reuse and waste awareness. So again, that's $10,000 that we year on year don't typically fully allocate. So I think in terms of increasing the budget, it's just taking note that the budget that we do have allocated at present isn't normally fully allocated at the moment.
It would appear that B does not exclude the level of funding provided, and it appears desirable to actually have some criteria and assessment processes regardless. So I'm just wondering whether B actually just leaves the options open to consider as part of the budget with some criteria and assessment being looked at in the meantime. Ian?
I mean, we talked about the clean-up of rubbish and everything, and there's nothing worse than it could be the main street of Lumsden or Dipton or D Street. The trouble is now that if you get a community group together to pick this rubbish up, traffic management means you've got to put cones out just about, because and this is the hard thing, because everyone sees it, and especially with the strong winds we've had, and it accentuates that rubbish. So I mean, I'd like to see more cleanups, because everyone likes their town or city looking clean. There's no two ways about it.
Which points to increasing funding in the budget.
Yeah, if we can do it practically, and it doesn't get overshadowed by the bureaucracy of actually achieving what we want to do.
Yes, Scott.
I don't know if we need to specifically increase the funding, because as Fiona's pointed out, there's capacity there. I think focusing on the outcomes and looking at that and matching that and getting that awareness out there. And I was reflecting on the Winton Open Day that was this weekend, and I remember last year the bins were overflowing and people were still putting rubbish on the bin that clearly wasn't a bin anymore because it was full, and that ends up blowing around and getting on the side of the road. So there's, I think, capacity at events like that to provide some education as well and some support. It wasn't so bad this year, but I did notice it last year. But I think if we focus on our outcomes, and if there is a need for a budget, at that point we can revise it, but rather than just throwing some money at it and hoping we'll get somewhere, I think B is a more logical approach.
Christine?
Just before I head out, I just note that with the previous discussion I had about the Dipton groups picking up the rubbish, AB Lime supported that with and managed all that in terms of the disposal of the rubbish as well. So very good community project supported by AB Lime, which was appreciated by the community.
So I guess what it points to in events like that is it's not only better information, but I guess is WasteNet itself ensuring there's a plan in place for the disposal and the follow-up, which I think if you're thinking almost from waste minimisation, it's an issue that probably needs to be dealt with as part of the plan as well.
Yes.
Yeah, good point. All right, so Neville, following that, were you wanting to refine how you did your recommendation, and then I'll come back to Barry?
Me?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think we definitely need B. And A, I still think that we should just retain A and B.
So you're moving both A and B.
Yep.
Do I have a seconder for that? Ian, thank you. Second. All right, any further discussion? Barry?
Yeah, as far as all their rubbish that blows around their streets, 99% probably of that is from takeaways. Have we got any plan to talk to any of the takeaway, like Kentucky Chook and McDonald's and that? People just have that sort of food and just chuck it out the window.
I'm mindful of the night and day that you pass as you come into Invercargill, which when they applied for their resource consent, the council actually imposed conditions on it in terms of the bins that were required to be put outside. So it's almost bordering on, I guess, at an implementation level, excuse me, line with the individual councils, but from a strategic and governance point of view, it is an issue that we should be picking up on from an education point of view as well. Whether it flows on to something that should be considered as part of the bylaw is an issue to look at in the context of that when it comes up. Neville?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an interesting concept, and a lot of the discussion that's been had about the rubbish around most of the towns and the streets are basically on state highways, and I'm just wondering if the lack of funding from Waikato or NZTA is causing this bit of a problem, and that, as we all know, contractors will do the minimum amount of what they possibly can for the least amount of money, well, the most amount of money they've got. So I'm just wondering if, because of their budget cuts, are we seeing the increase in rubbish because of this fault? You know, they're not actually physically going out cleaning the highways as much, which is a point that we could probably ask the question to.
Mm-hmm. Any other comment, feedback? So we've got a motion that the report be received, that in terms of A, we increase funding as part of the next financial year, and B, develop and implement application criteria and assessment processes. So,
Just a note from my point of view, I don't support A, Mr Chair, I only support B, so I don't know if that will change how the motion goes, but yeah, I'm not in favour of increasing the budget.
okay, so do you want me to split it?
Please.
All right, so we've got a mover and a seconder.
Just a
Yep.
moment. How much, Fiona, do we have not used carry forward?
The majority of those, so we've got $18,000 of the 50k fund, and then the majority of the last two is still sitting in the existing budget. The $5,000 for community cleanups and the $10,000 for community events.
Okay, right. That takes care of A then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the meantime,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So I'll move in relation to receiving the report of event funding and sponsorship and review. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. I'll deal with B first. So all those in favour of B, to develop and implement application criteria and assessment processes. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. With regard to A, revising the 2024-25 budget to increase funding for waste management and minimisation events and sponsorship. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against?
No.
No. So lost. So we're then left with receiving the report and developing and implementing criteria and assessment processes. Which takes us to item 11, the WasteNet Southland Joint Waste Management Agreement Review outcomes, which is a fairly comprehensive report, and unless there's, no, it's of such significance, I think we should give a brief.
So this report in the prefacing paper summarised the outcomes of the stakeholder engagement process that was undertaken over the past couple of months. So that was comprised of engagement both with individual stakeholders who have involvement with WasteNet, both at a governance and at a staff level, and then also facilitated sessions with each individual council. So from the individual stakeholder element, there were some very clear themes that came through, and those are highlighted in the report. And in terms of the facilitated sessions, there wasn't a clear and consistent outcome from each of the three councils in terms of how to move forward with this review, and that informs the recommendation that's included in the prefacing paper.
So any questions first?
Just an acknowledgement of the process. I was impressed with it. I thought it was very thorough and well done.
Right, so we have three recommendations here that we received the report, endorse the next steps to do a review process under the Local Government Act, Section 17A, and thirdly endorse the recommendation of the director to commence regular and formalised reporting to each of the councils. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Barry moved, second from Ms. Scott. So I will open it up for any discussion. I do wonder in terms of the options of moving forward. So the intent is to get a report done. What do you anticipate is the timing of that?
The timing is quite fortuitous in that we have to do the Section 17A review as part of our business case for procurement anyway, and that's scheduled for the first quarter of next year, so we can dovetail into that process, which means we're not going to be waiting too long for that to be completed.
And the intent then is to report back to each of the councils in terms of getting some feedback. I do wonder though whether this group should be making a recommendation to the councils and actually ranking the options. So I'd be interested in feedback on that. Do we go to the councils and wait for feedback from them before looking at choosing a pathway forward, or do we actually rank the options before we go to the councils?
I would want to go to my council to get the rankings, so it becomes a bit of a seesaw.
Any other views around the table? Ian?
I guess I've been on WasteNet since 2010, so I've sort of seen it evolve and go various places. I think it's a unique thing that three councils can get together and work with. I can't see that happening with Three Waters, but that's something completely different. And it's higher stakes as well. But this is something, what we've seen evolve is we've seen AB Lime evolve, we've seen Recycle South, and now we're going to be slowly working through. We've dealt with glass, and I think we've come to something sensible with glass, as in forgetting about it. And now we've got the green thing, the green monster to deal with. So I think this committee goes really well. So I'm not looking at any changes at all. I think it's great.
I think this body is an excellent example of the way councils can work together, and a model that we could well be following for other things as well as we go forward. Now, at the bottom of page 211, The intent is to have a workshop to look at function, strategic objectives and council service expectations. When do you wish to do that?
So it can probably be done in parallel with the Section 17A review, because irrespective of the model, we're going to be achieving those, or intending to achieve those same outcomes. So I would say in the first quarter of next year. Like, that was one of the things that the review highlighted quite strongly across the board, was that there was a high level of disparity in terms of what people saw as the key service deliverables and intended outcomes from WasteNet. So I do feel it's important that that's addressed sooner rather than later.
All right, any other feedback, comments? I was interested in one of the comments that came back that highlighted, with regard to our reserves, that we should be looking at an upper and a lower band of which the reserve should be managed, which I thought was an excellent idea. And I look forward to the discussion that we have in terms of the way our reserves are used moving forward. So any other feedback from members? Rob's just putting it as face rather than indicating. And an option that would have been taken as a bid, I think. We have a mover and a seconder, so all those in favour of the recommendation say aye, please. Against, carried. Which takes us to the last item, item 12, in terms of meeting frequency, where it's been recommended that in effect we have meetings 2 monthly next year. Given the significance of the review of WasteNet and its structure, given the waste minimisation plan, as well as the flow-ons from, I guess, the Section 17A assessment, what's the feeling around the table in terms of meeting frequency moving forward? To me, the things I've just mentioned, it's essential that they're actually dealt with, considered, and outcomes put in place before next year's local body elections. Ian?
Well, we've got 17A to do, but as far as legislative proclamations from Wellington coming, I don't think there's anything coming, Fiona?
Not at the moment, we don't have a clear signal, no.
Right, so we've talked about the green waste thing, but there's no legislation there. So, but the 17A, whatever you think the workload is necessary.
So I guess it's come up at this meeting because council calendars need to be blocked and loaded. But we've got flexibility in terms of the workshops that you want to have, and some of the other, I guess, informal meetings that we need to have in terms of budget discussions and the like would go in the intervening months.
Yes, that's correct. So the last page shows the table of the forecast and standing reports, but it is envisaged that there will be workshops and amongst those, particularly around the WMMP.
So we have a recommendation that we receive the report, and if there's no further adjustments, Ian.
Just one question. You mentioned the magic word WMMP. Is there anything happening on the product stewardship thing? Product stewardship, as far as central government saying you're not going to package your product in this crap.
There was a template letter that came out last week, circulated to everybody to request signatures for that to go back to MFE to try and reliven the issue, but that's the latest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's all right.
So given the apparent lack of need to change the calendar, can I have a mover and a seconder that we receive the report, please? Ian moved. Second, Barry. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Which brings us to the end of the meeting. So thank you everyone for your input. Thank you for the staff, your moral support, if not the speaking as well. It's appreciated, and I'll declare the meeting closed.